delivery 20% face-to-face. Now, obviously, we haven't been in that position because of restrictions, etc. It's starting to unlock now everywhere. So Job Centre Plus, I think, have started to open from the 26th of April onwards. So we will start to see some face-to-face provisions. Another 1,000 clicks to go on to the next one. Oh, I seem to have stuck somewhere. Bear with me. Oh, I think someone's tried to request control, so it seems to have frozen. Let me just stop presenting for a second. I'll try again.
If not, I can take over, Paul.
No, you're okay. I think it's just got its.
I think this is a Teams issue that's been gone this week. Are you back?
It's still not letting me do it.
It's just moved. It's just done one.
Oh, did it? I've just clicked off it again now. Let me try again. Right, seamless. Let's have a look. Is it working now? There we go. Yeah, so there's the piece around the face-to-face meetings, which is obviously very important. We're using a few different tools in order to do that. One of the big parts on JETS is to identify transferable skills within the participants. We've obviously got a number of participants who've come from certain sectors that may now be struggling sectors. So it's looking at what are those kind of transferable skills that people have that they can work across sectors that are experiencing more growth in vacancies. Across here, it gives you a bit more flavour in terms of the career centre offer, looking at the kind of functional skills. But there is literally thousands of pieces of content within the online portal that the participants use.
Well, there's on the previous slide.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, customer experience regular meetings is what we can see.
Ah, right, it's flashing through on mine. In fairness, I've talked over that slide, so you'll get the slides eventually anyway. In terms of the slide I'm currently looking at, which you can't see, is just the volume of successes so far. So we've had 7,775 referrals to JETS. It's fair to say that initially we were fairly inundated with referrals, and our partners did a fantastic job in coping with that initial wave of referrals that we received. 500 odd on the first day, 400 odd on the second day, when we were expecting it to be less than 100. We've had 3,834 starts on JETS, and as of the time we are doing this presentation, which I'll know it will have changed since then, we've already had 472 participants into work. So as I say, it's a good contract. It's been successful. The partners are doing a fantastic job on it. I'll stop speaking now, and if anybody's got any kind of questions for myself or Karen, then we're happy to go through any more detail.
That's great. Thank you very much, guys. So, yeah, I mean, I know a bit more about JETS because my organisation delivers a little bit of it in England, and I think there's a general kind of, I suppose, a little bit of a kind of clash to some extent between what programmes like JETS are looking to do and what perhaps the previous generation of programmes, both in Scotland and in England, were focused on. You know, the last commissioning rounds really were about, you know, we're at a time when unemployment was at a low level, and therefore the focus was on hard to help groups. And obviously because of the economic circumstances in the last couple of years, you know, we are back again, I suppose, to having programmes where you're intervening with people relatively early on, not that early on, but relatively early on in their JSA claim. I think my question, I suppose, is probably more for one of, you know, maybe one that Karen can answer, or perhaps any of your delivery organisations that are on the call, which is maybe around what the kind of the differences are from a delivery perspective. If you're an organisation that's delivering a programme like JETS and you're also delivering programmes like Fair Start. So I know that we've got a couple of colleagues from Wise Group on the call. I don't know if there's anything they would want to add around what it feels like and what you know, because I think to the outside looking in, they look like very different programmes targeted at very different participant groups. I'm not absolutely certain that is the case from the lived experience, but I don't know if Alex or any colleagues from Wise Group might want to pitch in and give a view, or if Karen's got a view on that.
If I can just chip in first, I think it's what we are seeing is quite a mixture. I think it's fair to say, but we are seeing a huge amount of people that have never been unemployed before. which is exactly what JETS is aimed at, obviously. So we are seeing a lot of very newly unemployed people. That some people have been in work for 30 years for the same employer. Others of reasonably young people that have worked in the obvious sector like hospitality. So for them, they're the classes that because JETS customers that JETS was designed for. But we are seeing, I would say, an overlap where people have probably been through Fair Start in some cases, have had some long-term unemployment history, but then their circumstances have changed. They're no longer a carer, for instance. Their responsibilities might have changed, and they've been through various courses or various employability provisions, various courses, and are probably in a better place now, and actually as employable as the person that was at work 13 weeks ago.
Yeah. Thanks, Carmen.
Paul, if I can come in, Alex here at the Wise Group. I think there's an overlap with how things have gone, and it's kind of inevitable considering the landscape that we're working in just now. But I'd say one of the fundamental differences that is kind of born out of what Paul you've just articulated, in that the two, if you compare, let's say, Fair Start with JETS, they were designed and procured in completely different landscapes and different circumstances, and so the type of support, the type of customers, yes, there's a crossover. But then if you overlay what Paul Dunphy was just talking about there, and sort of showing from Capita and from, I suppose, from a delivery perspective, the resources and the structure in which JETS is delivered, so that what we've seen is a rich uptake of the online support that's available, a really well developed system that people can access with a good element of self-serve in it as well, and that that's been a real advantage from a delivery point of view, and I think from a customer's point of view as well. And we, as much as we are seeing people from different with different circumstances and a real range, it's the volume that's been the thing. We are still collectively as a delivery partners and working with Capita collectively, we're only a few months into this. And it was fair to say it was fairly bonkers at the start. I'm speaking on behalf of operational colleagues here as well. It was fairly bonkers at the start, but I think everybody did tremendously well to deal with that, and the numbers speak for themselves. So there's a real high volume, fast pace to this. And Fair Start's been slightly different from that over time as well. It's been, Fair Start by its nature is much more intense. But it's actually, I would say, and then coming back from a Wise Group perspective, it's an advantage, and we always saw this. Thinking about JETS before it was being formally procured and then won. It's an advantage to be able to see and interact with both of those programs from a delivery perspective, because I think it gives us greater insight. We work very well with the job centres, which are the driving force behind the referrals and people being able to access these. So it gives us really rich insight. So yeah, it's overly positive at the moment. But as I say, we're at the start of the journey, and there's still lots to do. But yeah, I mean, and from Paul and Karen's point of view, and again, I know I'm speaking largely on behalf of our operational colleagues who are working with, particularly Karen, every day by day. It's been excellent. The model which Paul and Karen have sort of articulated has been really, really good, and it's enabled us to just get really stuck in and help people and concentrate on doing that. Entirely concentrate on doing that, which has been really, really good. So I'll shut up now.
Okay, thank you, Alex. That's really useful. Thank you. Any questions or insights from anyone else on the call? Just feel free to. I don't think there's that many of us on, so feel free to just chuck in rather than put your hand up.
Not so much an insight, Paul, just a question. One of the kind of traditional challenges in new programs is kind of regional disparities. Is there the same this time round? Are you seeing referral numbers high in some areas and lower in others?
You're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it's fair to say we did a profile at the start as to where we anticipated referrals will come from, and that's pretty much correct. but it's fair to say we've got referrals, particularly from Aberdeenshire way, which were far in excess of what we expected based on the volumes we were looking at. So there are patches where we're getting more than we thought we would get. But overall, the contract splits are working out fairly as anticipated. I mean, it is a challenge because we've got, there's probably only 10% of the participant group that live in the very north parts of Scotland, and there is, the geography there. It is a challenging geography, but we are getting referrals from job centres up there. So, but yeah, I mean, I suppose the Aberdeen element is the main one I pick out as being, something we didn't expect.
And do you have a sense of what you think, and this is for Karen or Paul or for Alex, but what's your sense on what the participant demand will level out at once restrictions are eased, in terms of face-to-face and people having a willingness to kind of, access services by digital means? Yeah,
I mean, from my perspective, I would say it won't be the 20% we expected in terms of face-to-face demand. I think people have got used to doing things remotely. The contract does lend itself to working remotely. So I would say if we got 5 to 10% of it ending up being face-to-face, that's probably nearer the reality. But we're set up to do that. The partners have been great about being flexible about where to meet participants, etc. So we'll see how it goes when it does open up.
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you very much for that. If there are no more questions, just remains for me to say thank you very much for coming along and sharing your insights. I think it would probably be quite useful, perhaps a couple of meetings down the line to get a little bit more of an update on how things have gone. I believe there's the possibility of an extension to this contract that's kind of that may become apparent in the coming weeks. So therefore, JETS might be a bit more of a permanent part of the landscape for the next wee while, which I think would be welcome. Okay, thanks very much. Cool. Elizabeth, next on the agenda is you. I think you're going to talk to us about where we're at with the Ask Seth platform.
Okay, yeah. What I'm going to do now is attempt to share my screen. I'm getting very odd feedback. Are other people getting feedback when I speak? No, just me. That's okay then. So, okay. This is something that we launched last Friday on Employability Day. It is what we're describing is we've just reached the end of phase 1, and phase 1 was getting the first upload of organisations that deliver skills, employment and training right across the UK. So I'm going to show it this morning to show what we've got on there now. And really, if your organisation hasn't submitted the information to Seth via ERSA, we're really appealing for you to do it, because we want to do a big launch of this platform in the middle of June. Last Friday, somehow, the Sun newspaper picked up on it and ran a small article, and we think that they knew about Employability Day and went on the ERSA website, because we've never press released Ask Seth yet. So we're really appealing to people to get us the info so that we can do it properly. So what it is going to be when it's there in all its glory in June is a go-to place for job seekers, for advisors, say money advice or housing projects, to actually find the nearest employment support. And the searches are really driven by people putting in a town or postcode, but people can also put in a specialist interest, which I'll just show you as well. So the best way to just do this, if you can bear with me, is if I put, say I put Glasgow as in there, and then I hit search, it will then come up with the organisations that have already given us the information that deliver in Glasgow. So we've got Apex Glasgow, the Wise Group, India, Shaw Trust. And what it then starts to, so yeah, obviously Scottish Training Federation, Lennox Partnership, Routes to Work. What you'll notice now is we're going out beyond Glasgow because it kind of goes out from that postcode. So we need to get more things in, more things from Glasgow. I'm hoping one of my ERSA colleagues is letting in people that are in the lobby because it's coming up on my screen. And then the other thing is, say, let's put in a postcode. So I'll put in ML4 and search again. And what it will do is take us to Routes to Work, and we could look at their provision on Main Street, and we would open up the map and you can see where they are. Where it really is strong is where we've got links to people's websites, and usually when I demonstrate this, I go to Leicester and I put in a Leicester postcode and it comes up with Leicester provision, and we then see the business to business website with all its offers. So that's another thing. If your organisation's already on SEF, but we don't have, where we have the map link, we don't have a website link, please just test what we've got, because if we have the website link, we can get much more information. But you'll see here it has phone numbers, it has directions. And the other thing is people can put in search terms. So when we ask an organisation to give us the information, you get the choice of 10 tags. And we've got things like applying for a job, apprenticeship, autism. There's lots of mental health and health resources on here as well that were gifted to us from a previous piece of work that Seth did. That Frog did. We're aware that there's a lot of things that are currently being tagged as business support that we're tidying up at the moment, because we've got all sorts of things that shouldn't be in that category. And the other thing we're trying to populate at the moment is the Kickstart provision, so that every Kickstart gateway that's in the ERSA community of good practice is on here, so that if people are looking for wraparound support or looking to employers have decided they'd rather be with a gateway than go on their own, they'll go on that Kickstart session, and which I've just lost. Anyway, this is Seth. And the other thing we've got, I won't show you videos, which I have done at other meetings, but we've got what we're calling our Employability Voices. So under each of these headings, there'll be some videos, and we are now populating the site with more videos. And I know we've talked to colleagues at Routes to Work about providing some. So this is an appeal really that we get some really strong videos from Scotland on the site. That's it. Hope that's interesting and useful, and if you haven't already given us your information, please do so. And I'm hoping that Adam can put in the chat have I stopped sharing my screen? Yeah, Adam can put in the chat the link to the template to get the information on ASSEF. Okay. Should I do the Pamela Smith update at the end?
Yeah, I would do that at the end. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would just urge everyone to kind of reach out to your own networks and make sure that we are making the content of SEF is relevant and as complete as it can do across Scotland. I think with another one of my hats on, we did a piece of work with a number of other networks, including the Scottish Training Federation and Third Sector Employability Forum and a couple of others. And one of the things we looked at was around market stewardship and commissioning, and this was kind of last summer, last spring. And one of the things that came out of that, particularly from a Scotland context, is that we don't really have anything that's even halfway decent that tells us the strength and depth of provision that exists across the whole of the country. There are some good local authority level pieces of data and kind of notice boards about, but actually if all the delivery organisations and people who are connected to delivery can populate their details on this, that is not just useful for potential participants and job seekers. It's actually useful for commissioners, because that will help them understand just what you have. Do you have a depth of provision? And I'm looking forward to future programmes like No One Left Behind that are going to be very much local authority commissioned. Having enough of the right organisations is a key part of what choices are made by commissioners. So please make sure your details are on it, and pass it on to kind of friends and colleagues that are not on here. Okay, great.
Yeah, and is it worth me just saying, Paul, that you don't need to be an ERSA member to be on the ASSETH website? Although this is hosted by ERSA, it was really seen as something that belonged to the sector, as big and as wide. We are saying at this point that videos will be ERSA members only, because there's got to be some benefit for ERSA members on it. But the real strength of this will be if we get every organisation, and if there are other websites that we should be facing, we're going to do that, so we can link to other resources, to anything else. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Okay, we're kind of nearly on time, which is quite good. I think we're basically on time. We're less than 10% late. That's on time. The next agenda item, which is the main agenda item of the day, we're delighted to welcome back David Eiser from the Fraser of Allander Institute. Some of you might have been on the call we had earlier on in the year, where David was able to share some insights into what's going on in the Scottish economy at this point in time, and where things might be going forward. Obviously, we're at a point between people voting and finding out the makeup and the shape of the government, but there's a very fluid environment out there, and David's very generously agreed to come to come along and share his views on what the projected state of the Scottish economy is likely to be for the remainder of this year and into next. It was a very insightful session last time round. So David, over to you. I think David's screen has frozen. Anyone else hear him? No.
No, it looks frozen, Paul.
It does look frozen, just as he was about to start, Robin.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. There you go. We'll turn our cameras off. That might help, David, but we can hear you now. Fine, thank you.
I think Callum's got the slides, so he could share those.
Well, shall I try and share them from here?
We can see them now, so yeah.
Okay, great. So I don't need to share them from here then. So that's great. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm not going to make any forecasts or predictions myself. But I'm going to talk about some of the forecasts that other people are making, and some of the sort of factors and risks that are underpinning those forecasts. So if we go on to the first slide, the next slide. Thanks. So I've got a couple of slides, first of all, just to sort of talk about where the economy is now. And we're still in this really incredibly unprecedented situation where, on the one hand, we've got a huge drop in economic activity compared to normal. So the economy is operating about 7% below where it was before the pandemic. That's according to the latest figures we have from February. And that's really pretty unprecedented. I mean, that's over double the fall in economic output that we saw during the financial crisis. But on the other hand, we've got official labour market statistics that are pointing to a really much more upbeat picture. So we're still looking at an unemployment rate in Scotland of only around 4.5%. And that's half the unemployment rate that we saw in the aftermath of the financial crisis. There are about 120,000 unemployed in Scotland at the moment. There were 240 unemployed in Scotland at the end of in the aftermath of the financial crisis, with an unemployment rate of 11%. Now, there is increasing evidence to believe that those official labour market statistics are missing some things, are not quite giving us the full picture. Basically, the issue here, there's various technical reasons, but basically it comes down to difficulties for the ONS in delivering their labour force survey on a sort of telephone-based setup, whereas previously it was done on a face-to-face basis. So we need to look at other data sources. And one of the other things we can look at is Hmrc's data on pay-as-you-earn tax data. And what that's suggesting is that there's been a decline in around 3% in employee jobs over the course of the pandemic. That's about 80,000 jobs. And of course, what we also know is that there are still, as of February, there are still around 360,000 people on furlough in Scotland. That's about 15% of employees. So there are some mixed messages, but this really very unusual position where economic activity is down a long way, but some of the labour market stats are painting a much more upbeat picture. The big question, of course, for those furloughed workers is to what extent are those remaining furloughed workers, effectively deferred unemployed rather than avoided unemployed, and I'll return to that in a bit. But if we could go on to the next slide, thanks. So there's a couple of other things that it's worth pointing out about where we are now, the sort of impacts that the pandemic is having on the economy. Obviously, the health impacts of the pandemic have been felt very, very unevenly. We know that the health impacts have been felt unevenly by age and by ethnicity and by geography and so on, but the economic impacts have been really unevenly felt too. So here are just a few dimensions by which the impact has been very uneven. Clearly, by sector, this has been an incredibly uneven recession. So I said earlier that 15% of jobs overall in Scotland are currently furloughed. But if you look at hospitality, that's 2/3 of jobs still furloughed. In arts and recreation, that's 60% of jobs still furloughed as of February. Now, of course, we expect that when we have data for May, it will show an improvement in this position. But in terms of the latest data, these are still huge numbers. In terms of age, obviously, the recession is impacting younger people, younger workers more than others. So although unemployment as a whole hasn't really picked up yet, for 18 to 24s, the unemployment rate has increased from 8% to 13%. So basically, since the start of the pandemic, there are around 30,000 fewer young people in employment in Scotland. And roughly half of those have become unemployed, and the other half of them have become economically inactive. So they're either not looking for work or they've taken up education opportunities. And by geography, well, the northeast of Scotland has kind of been hit twice over by the pandemic, in the sense that it's been affected by the restrictions in the same way as everywhere else, but it's also been affected indirectly in terms of the way that the pandemic has hit the offshore sector. So in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, we've seen a 6% decline in employee jobs, according to Hmrc's data, compared to that 3% for Scotland as a whole. Now, alongside that, of course, what we're seeing during the pandemic are huge social changes. Outlined some here in terms of how we work, how we consume, and what we consume. So almost 1/3 of us are now doing some work from home. Incredibly, that was only 5% pre-pandemic. Retail sales, online retail now accounts for 35% of total retail sales, which is up from 20% just before the pandemic started. And clearly what we consume is changing a lot too. I'm sure we're all kind of spending less at the moment on coffees on our way to work, travel, and so on, and maybe a bit more on things that we didn't used to spend quite as much on. But the big question, of course, in terms of the longer term impacts of the pandemic is the extent to which these big social changes might persist and become permanent. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is showing, actually, if you could give another click, and another one. The animation hasn't quite worked as it was supposed to, but never mind. So that light blue line, this is the Scottish Fiscal Commission. The Scottish Fiscal Commission is Scotland's official forecasting organisation, and this was this is their latest view of things, which was produced in January. It's likely to have changed since, which I'll come to in a bit, but this is their view of things in January. That light blue line, which is kind of gradually trending upwards, that was what they thought would happen to economic activity before the pandemic. So gradual increase in economic growth. And of course, what happened in the second quarter of last year is we saw this unprecedented fall in economic activity, over 20% fall. An initial big bounce back during the second half of 2020 as restrictions and so on were relaxed. If you could give another click on the slide, please. Thanks. But then what we think we're seeing in the early part of 2021 is another fall in economic activity. And then what the SFC thinks is going to happen is that throughout the rest of 2021, economic growth is going to pick up to be quite fast. So you'll see some, exciting sounding numbers about, economic growth being 8% or 9% in 2021. Of course, it's from a very low base. And then what the SFC thinks is going to happen is that by late this year or early next year, the economy will return to the same rate of growth as it was seeing before the pandemic, but at a permanently lower level. And it won't be until late 2023 or 2024 that the economy returns to its pre-pandemic size. Now, as I say, this forecast was made in January, and it's really quite striking how forecasters have become gradually more optimistic since January. So this forecast for Scotland was in line with the OBR's forecasts in November last year. But in March this year, the OBR kind of had got a bit more optimistic about how things would go. And yesterday's Bank of England forecast got even more optimistic about the speed of the recovery. But the important thing to note is that all of these forecasters, even the latest relatively more optimistic forecast from the Bank of England, they still think that the pandemic will have a permanent impact on the size of the economy. So in all future years, the economy is going to be smaller than it would otherwise have been without the pandemic. So if we just go to the next slide, please. So the one question is, why do forecasters think that the pandemic is going to have this permanent impact on the size of the economy? Well, that relates to something that economists call scarring, this idea that the pandemic will have a permanent impact on the economy. So scarring comes about through various reasons. One of these is that ongoing uncertainty and risk aversion reduces business investment. And that includes investment in sort of tangible stuff, buildings and assets and so on, but also in intangible things like research and development. Another reason that we're likely to see scarring is that we've clearly got a lot of people who are longer term unemployed and a lot of people who are on furlough and have had the best part of a year not getting on the job training, on the job learning, and so there's an extent to which some skills atrophy. And then the last two, probably the most important parts of this scarring, relate to structural change. So this goes back to the question of to what extent are these changes in consumption that we're seeing during the pandemic going to become permanent? And that has the degree of structural change has implications for existing capital, the use of existing capital and the use of existing skills in the economy. So as the structural nature of the economy changes, some of the things that firms have invested in might become relatively obsolete. Now, potentially there are some sorts of IT equipment that can easily be reconditioned, repurposed, used in different sectors and so on, but there's lots of sorts of capital investment that may not be particularly relevant or viable in a sort of new looking economy. And similarly, when it comes to skills, there's a big question clearly about the extent to which some of the workers, employees who were employed in the economy pre-pandemic will find that there is still demand for their sorts of skills in a new normal post-pandemic economy. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. So yeah, this is really in many ways the key question, but it's one that there's huge uncertainty about. And all the forecasters, Bank of England and the OBR, they basically all agree that some of these changes that we've seen during the pandemic in terms of spending habits, consumer behavior, some of those will persist, but we don't really know which of those will persist and to what extent they'll persist and to what extent some of those changes in habits will just be temporary and will go back to the kind of world, the kind of economy that we were in pre-pandemic. So some structural change will take place. And then the question is, well, how easy will it be for people who have worked in one sector to move effectively into another sector? So this is where economists talk about the ability of the labour market to reallocate, for people to transfer from declining sectors to growing sectors. And there is an optimistic view, and this is a view that actually I've heard the governor of the Bank of England express recently. And that optimistic view says, well, we're actually in a much better place than we were in the 80s and 90s, because the structural change that was happening in the 80s and 90s was huge decline in some quite specialist manufacturing employment, and a rise in certain types of service employment that was very, very different. Whereas what we're seeing potentially now is something quite different, and that's a decline in some sorts of service-related employment and growth in other sorts of service-related employment, and arguably the sorts of tasks and skills that are required in these growing sectors are much more transferable from the sectors that are seeing declines. So there is this sort of relatively optimistic view that some of these issues about reallocation might not be as problematic as they have been following some recessions of the past. But having said that, I think all the main forecasters, including the Scottish Fiscal Commission, agree that some of those currently furloughed workers are not going to be seamlessly reintegrated into the labour market as the furlough scheme is withdrawn later in the summer. to what extent do we think that those currently furloughed workers will become unemployed? In other words, to what extent are those currently furloughed workers effectively people whose unemployment has been deferred? Well, that of course is difficult to say, but there's increasing optimism. It's really striking how the view of forecasters has changed in the last few months, given the success of the vaccine rollout and the effectiveness of the vaccine. So in January, the Scottish Fiscal Commission was forecasting that unemployment would get up to about 7.5% in Scotland by summer of this year. And that was in line at the time with the OBR's forecast for the UK. But by March, the OBR had revised down its estimate so that it thought that unemployment would only get up to 6.5% by later this year. And yesterday, the Bank of England said that they thought unemployment would only get up to about 5.5% later this year. Although they did say that there is still quite a lot of uncertainty around that, and it could be anywhere between 3.5% and 7.5%. So there is this increasing optimism on the part of the forecasters, and if unemployment ends up only getting to about 5.5%, then that would be pretty remarkable in the context of the size and the depth of the recession that we've been through. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So, of course, COVID isn't the only thing that's happening. It's not the only thing that's influencing economic activity at the moment. Brexit is the new deal that came into force at the start of the year, is having tangible impacts for exporters in a variety of different sectors. Now, some sectors are clearly affected more than others, and the media is obviously focused a lot on the sectors that are experiencing really big problems, which is mainly agriculture, fisheries, and meat products. And it's clear that a lot of the problems that those sectors are facing are not just teething problems. They do reflect the nature of the new trade agreement. Now, those sectors, you could say, well, they're all quite small in the scheme of the economy as a whole, but of course they are a big deal in some parts of the country and for some communities. But it's important to remember as well, of course, that the main impacts of Brexit will be in a way much less visible, because the main impacts of Brexit are really over the longer term, the challenges and the additional frictions that they impose on all exporting businesses, and the likely sort of dampening impact on the economy that will have over a long period. And of course, the combination of Brexit and the pandemic is likely to create skill shortages in a variety of sectors. I mean, agriculture and care are possibly the two most obvious ones. We're never really going to know. I mean, at the moment, we still don't have very good data on the extent to which the number of people, the number of EU people in Scotland has declined since the start of the pandemic. But even when we do have those figures more reliably, we're never really going to know to what extent those falls are due to Brexit and to what extent they're due to the pandemic. But it's clear that there has been a pretty big decline in the number of people in Scotland and the UK as a whole from EU countries over the last year. So in terms of conclusions, I mean, there is increasingly a lot of optimism about and a lot of good news in relation to the vaccine program, which is incredible. And so, this good news in terms of vaccine rollout, vaccine effectiveness, combined with the increasing evidence that there is a huge amount of accumulated savings in the economy as a result of the prolonged lockdown, means that forecasters are increasingly optimistic about the outlook over the next year or two, to the extent that we might see by the end of this year, according to the Bank of England's latest forecast, the economy, the UK economy as a whole, basically back to its pre-COVID size and growing at the same rate that it did previously. But of course, there is a lot of uncertainty around the scale of the structural change that we might see as a result, and the ability of the labour market to adapt to that. And we still don't really know how consumers, people generally, are going to respond, even when restrictions are completely rolled back, and to what extent people might behave differently or might go about their lives differently, and what that will mean for the economy. And of course, there are big risks here. It was really striking, kind of listening to the news and watching the news yesterday, how you had these two stories next to each other. On the one hand, the Bank of England with its kind of bullish, buoyant outlook, and on the other hand, this news that there are clusters of this new Indian variant in the UK, and we don't really know much at the moment yet about how the existing vaccines are effective in relation to that new variant. So there are clearly some big potential risks out there, and Brexit is unfortunately a further kind of headwind and dampener on the economy in the longer term. I mean, you know, forecasters basically think that COVID will be a temporary, a big temporary hit, but it will nonetheless be sort of fairly temporary, whereas Brexit will dampen the economic outlook for many years to come. So that's my conclusion, and I'm happy to take questions. I'd also, if it's okay, I promised that I would mention something on behalf of a colleague, if that's okay, which is a piece of research that she's just starting. This is my colleague Emma Congreve at the Fraser of Allander Institute, and she's just starting a piece of work which is funded by the Standard Life Foundation, and it's basically looking at ways that policy can reduce child poverty in Scotland. And clearly one of the things she'll be doing, as everyone always does, is sort of model the impact of different social security policies on reducing child poverty. But Emma's also very keen to make sure that we don't sort of neglect the sometimes more difficult to model but nonetheless important policies around employability and the role that employability initiatives and schemes can play in reducing child poverty. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what she's looking for at this stage, but she's quite keen to sort of speak to some of you who have experience on the ground in terms of what works most effectively in relation to employability schemes. And her email address is there, and she'd be very keen to touch base with any of you if you wanted to get in touch with her. So I hope you don't mind that plug for my colleague's research. That's where I will leave it. Thank you. Sorry, I seem to have spoken for a bit longer than I imagined.
No problem at all, David. Thank you very much for that. That was incredibly insightful. I think it's the mist is clearing a little bit in the landscape, but there's probably still a lot of room for things to be further clarified. And shall we open up to questions? I think we've got a hand up from Annie Dell. Annie, over to you. I think you might be on.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Annie. I work at Salvation Army. I don't usually attend these forums, so I just wanted to say thank you for that. I've been scribbling notes like crazy over here. David, I just wanted to go back to slide 2, because you mentioned something about economic activity, and I missed it, and it wasn't on the slide. You mentioned something about economic activity, And I want to know what that stat was. And then the second part was, do we have any insight onto what you mean by when they're inactive? Because someone studying versus someone who's not looking for work is very different in terms of what we're doing in employment support.
Yes. Slide 2. So I think this was possibly in relation to when I was talking about the age, the impacts on people's different age groups, was it? And I think I said that what the official labour market statistics are telling us is that there are 30,000 fewer young people in employment in Scotland now compared to pre-pandemic, and basically half of those are unemployed according to the official definition. So they're out of work and they're looking for work and they're available to start work in 2 weeks or whatever the definition is, and half of them are inactive according to the sort of labour market definition, the labour market sense of that word, and the word inactivity is clearly not really it's not really the best word, but it's the word that official labour market people use. So people who are inactive can include people who are in full-time study, people who are caring. So they may be very far from inactive in the sense of the word as most people think of it, but from a labour market perspective, they're inactive because they're not in work or looking and available to start.
So my question is, do we have a sense of what exactly they're doing? Because a young person who's studying is very different from a young person we should be engaging with right now. Yes,
technically we could look at that. I don't have those stats to hand.
Thank you.
I can see if I can dig it out. The trouble with this is that when it comes to labour market statistics, you've got to remember that there's a sample size for these things, and then the sample. I'm trying to remember what the sample size is on a monthly basis for Scotland, but it's not huge. And then if you drill down to the 18 to 24-year-olds, you're really narrowing the sample. And then if you drill down to the 18 to 24-year-olds who are inactive in January, you've got such a small sample that you've got to be very, very careful about then saying, well, half of the inactive 18 to 24-year-olds were in education and half were caring or whatever. Because you've got such a, you're probably basing that off about 10 people. So you do, in theory, the data is there, but in practice, we would probably have to, put massive caution on it, on any numbers that we saw. Could do it for the UK and assume this is what we end up doing quite often when you get down into those small numbers. Do it for the UK and assume that things won't be materially different for Scotland, given that the headline labour market stuff isn't materially different for Scotland.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Any other questions that people have before I jump in? Any hands or anyone want to just jump in? Nope. Okay, Robin.
Thanks, Paul. Just really an observation. David, you were saying that the current rate of unemployment in Scotland is 4.5%, and the Bank of England forecast for the UK as a whole yesterday was suggesting somewhere in the region of 5.5%. Obviously, that's not a big jump from where we're currently at, and I do recognise that a lot of these forecasts are changing rapidly as the the injections roll out and the vaccine rolls out, but not something you might hear me saying very often, but is there a risk that government is throwing too much money at solving an unemployment problem that might not actually materialise?
Well, I guess you could flip that. I might be inclined to flip that and say, well, potentially this would vindicate the approach. If these latest forecasts do turn out to be true, then I think you could argue that the government's approach to this has been pretty good. To go through a year-long, more than a year-long pandemic with big lockdowns, if we emerged with a peak unemployment rate of 5.5%. That would be pretty good. Could the government have targeted it more, to have spent less? Possibly, although it's not. In terms of the furlough scheme for employees itself, I think that's been pretty good. You can make more of a case, I think, for saying that some of the self-employed support hasn't been very well targeted, so that some unemployed, some self-employed have not been able to access support, particularly those who have become self-employed relatively recently prior to the pandemic started, whereas others have received support who probably didn't need to because they've carried on operating. So on that front, there was probably scope for the government to have done things slightly more efficiently. But I mean, I guess I would take the outcome and the higher expenditure and say that was a vindication in many ways of the policy, rather than a criticism of overspending.
Thanks, David. Can I just go back to a couple of points that you raised, which are interconnected? You talked about the permanent nature of some of the impacts of the pandemic, and talked about some of those structural challenges, particularly around about kind of people not having the skills that they need, and kind of structural mismatches within the labour market. And also, when you kind of talked about Brexit, that clearly is a challenge yet to be fully appreciated around the withdrawal of EU and other kind of foreign worker labour, and the challenge that creates for certain sectors in a very heavy sense in certain communities. Is there anything are there any observations, I suppose, that you might have around what that might mean for what government priorities should be? I think a concern I have is that the plethora of employability support programmes that we have, both at a UK level and particularly within Scotland, are very much focused on, if you like, the supply side of things. It's about getting individuals who might be out of work or might be significantly disadvantaged back into a job. There's very little requirement or investment within those programmes for significantly altering people's skill set beyond things like soft skills. And where we do have skills programmes, they operate by and large in isolation of employability programmes, and are in Scotland particularly very age restricted. If you happen to be over 24 in Scotland, there's very little in the way of if you like, state funded support to kind of change your skills, other than the recent National Transition Training Fund. Things are a little bit better with programmes like Adult Education Budget in England, but is there a requirement, because of those risks, to think about coupling up employability and skills, so that we are not only getting people back into work, but we're getting them into the jobs that the economy needs in the future?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you raise a lot of good points there. I mean, I have to say, this is not the sort of skills employability area is not an area that I'm very close to these days. I do remember kind of, it must be at least 10 years ago, hearing that I know that there were a lot of initiatives around then to try and better link up skills and employability initiatives in Scotland, and it's disappointing if there's still a lot of challenges in that area, because it's clearly been an area that for many years where there's a need for better integration. And I certainly think that the age point is very relevant too, because although I did focus on the young, there's evidence too that this has not been a great pandemic by any means for older workers either. And so thinking about the age eligibility is definitely an issue. And thinking about the sectoral specific nature of the demand side, I think is a really good point to make as well. And it's definitely something that I think that there needs to be more consideration of. And I think it probably has to go hand in hand as well with a a better think about the nature of terms and conditions in some of these sectors. I mean, agriculture and care I picked out as two that are kind of going to be affected possibly most by Brexit and EU labour shortages. And these are two sectors that are kind of notorious in terms of pay and conditions. And, that's something that the government really needs to grapple with as well. You saw in the election campaign recently, most of the parties sort of recognising that for care and sort of proposing to take measures to increase pay in the sector. We'll have to see to what extent that materialises, but that's something that can't be neglected either.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Any final points or questions for David before we wrap up this agenda item? I'm taking that as a no. David, thank you very much for your time again. I think that was incredibly insightful, and I think looking at things from the perspective of the economy is I think it helps a lot of us that work in the wider employability sector to understand the landscape that bit more clearly in terms of what the impacts might be on our programmes and on our teams. So thank you very much again for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Bye. So we have one final agenda item, Elizabeth, over to you to talk about our next meeting.
Okay, yes, we'd invited Pamela Smith from Improvement Service to come this morning to talk about progress and plans on No One Left Behind. She's on annual leave, otherwise she would have been with us today, and she's going to give us a date in May. And so watch your inboxes. I didn't manage to get the date offer before she went on leave, but I thought it was worth just giving that sort of shout out, but also saying that I'm aware she's going to speak at Third Sector Employability Forum, and she's going to talk with the Scottish Training Federation, and some of you are members of those. We've talked to Pamela about it still being relevant to do an event for ERSA with a different slant and take on it. So it's not, it's not an event to think, oh, I'll see her at that one and not at another. I'm not articulating this very well. So please watch your inboxes for the date with Pamela. And I also thought it was worth just bringing to people's attention an event we've got on Tuesday morning with at 10 o'clock, I think it's 10:30, with the Recruitment and Employment Confederation talking about recruitment and economic recovery. I'll pop that in the chat in a minute, because I think that will be a really good session. So with the RAC. Okay. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. If I could just echo the point around the upcoming session that's happening in May, where Pamela has kindly agreed to come along and have a chat. I think I've yet to meet someone that's involved in the delivery landscape of employability services, whether you are a third sector organisation or a private sector organisation or a public sector organisation, where there's not a strong sense of concern, I suppose, around quite what life looks like in the world of No One Left Behind. Most people are incredibly supportive of what it's out to achieve, but I think there's a real nervousness around the lack of engagement, I suppose, with any form of delivery organisations, and that's why I suppose we, from an Employment Support Scotland perspective and other forums, have said, look, you need to come and talk to us, because we're probably kind of 10 months out, I suppose, from a number of important programmes ending, and we really need to understand what that means, not just for organisations and the people that work in those services, but for the people that are currently accessing support. We need to make sure that whatever, with the powers we've got, whatever programmes we put in place are better than the ones they're replacing. So please do give that your full engagement if you wouldn't mind. Any other business before we finish up? Nope. Much easier when we're in a room, because people can just shout out. I'm looking across the screen for yellow hands. It's like The Simpsons. Listen, thank you very much for your time and for your engagement. Thanks again to colleagues from Capita. That was really useful, and also for Alex for chipping in. Thanks very much to David. A really insightful session. If you have any thoughts or views on what you'd like us to put on beyond the session with Pamela in May, I think we're due to meet again in June. I don't have the date in front of me. Please just drop any one of us a note. Drop Laura at ERSA a note, or Elizabeth a note, or myself or Robin, and we'll do our best to make sure that we are able to make these sessions as useful and purposeful as they can be. So have a great day, everyone. The weekend is beckoning. The sun isn't shining, but hey, you can't have everything. So enjoy your weekend, and I'll hopefully catch up with you, many of you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Paul de Palette, who chairs that meeting, just sent me an email saying, I love the Peggy Guggenheim, the print, by the way. I love Peggy Guggenheim's house in Venice. That's where that's from. I'm like, oh yes, me too.
Good feedback on the decor.
Yeah, that's it. You're going to have to tell me how to save this recording. I've gone completely blank about it. It's still happening. Yeah. It's still recording. No, just me. Press stop recording. Yeah. As easy as that.